Welcome to Afterwards. You've just published your first book, a remarkable book, a really terrific achievement. I enjoyed it immensely, and it's the subject of a lot of discussion these days among China analysts, as you know. The book is called One Child, the story of China's most radical experiment. And in a minute, we'll talk about why you chose this subject and how you went about answering some of the questions that were on your mind. But first, I think it would be helpful to define for people what it is we're actually talking about. So what is China's one-child policy?
Well, Evan, the one-child policy is really a bit of a misnomer. You know, it's just a name that we use to describe a set of a set of rules, that restrictions that China has placed to regulate the family, the population and the size of the family. Now, theoretically, you could more likely call it 1.5 child for a long time, and now, of course, they've moved it to a two-child policy. But, you know, in reality, it just means, you know, a lot of regulations.
So it's not one law particularly, but it's a sort of basket of policies that were put into effect. Yes, that's right. And so when did it happen? When did it go into effect? When did it begin, this one-child policy? Well,
some people count it as 1979. Some people count it as 1980. I count it as 1980 when the Communist Party sent out an open letter, supposedly to its members, saying, we are advising everybody to move to a one-child family. Now, it was advised, but it was really telling.
So people sometimes imagine that this was the kind of policy that would have gone into effect under Chairman Mao, but in fact what you're saying is it went into effect under Deng Xiaoping. What was going on in China at the time that was so important that people imagined that they needed this idea of a policy like this?
Well, Mao had just passed away. China had just come out of the Cultural Revolution. People were very poor, and also at the time China's population was growing. In fact, there was a significant worry that basically that China was just going to population was going to overwhelm, you know, its shores, and there wasn't going to be enough to go around, and therefore they really did need to do something.
You write in the book that you compared the one-child policy to a crash diet. You say, like crash dieting, the one-child policy was begun for reasons that had merit. So why did it begin? What was the initial rationale? You mentioned that they thought it was going to spill beyond China's borders. What was the goal, and how did they think they were going to accomplish it?
Well, it was mainly for economic reasons. You know, China at the time was very poor, and Deng and all the new leadership had basically staked their legitimacy on basically raising China out economically. And Deng had set into place a goal target for raising $1,000 per GDP per capita by the year 2000. And so working back from the goal, the planners figured out that this wasn't going to work at the current population growth rate, and therefore they needed to radically move to a one-child per family household in order to accomplish that. You know, economic growth is kind of like a cake, right? It's you know, productivity over numbers of mouths. So they figured out that it was a lot easier to control the numbers of mouths, you know, as well. So that was what they were going for. But the sad fact was China was already reducing its population. They already had a family population planning policy in place that was actually much less coercive. It was called the Later, Longer, and Fewer program, and the idea was to encourage
later, longer, and fewer program.
And fewer, you know, get married later, have longer period between your children, and have fewer children. That was the way it was supposed to go. It had been going for 10 years before the one-child policy. And during that period of time, the average family size had gone from about 6 kids to 3. So that was pretty successful. And a lot of experts argued that they should have just kept going at that rate. And if they had done that, then they would still have reduced the population without any of these side effects that the one-child policy engendered.
So who is Song Jian, and why is he important?
Oh, Song Jian was the head of a group of scientists who drew out the one-child policy. And what's interesting about them, and what a lot of people don't know, is that basically the one-child policy was drawn up by rocket scientists. Song Jian was a Russian-trained missile defense scientist who basically didn't have a lot of training in sociology or demography or any of the things that we would imagine that somebody who's drawing up something on population planning policy would have.
So why were rocket scientists designing this one? Why were they designing, you know, demography policy?
Well, to think that we have to sort of go back in time. So this is coming off the Cultural Revolution. So most of China's intelligentsia, you know, the economists, the sociologists, they were all very devalued. They had really suffered through the Cultural Revolution. They had no political capital. most of them didn't even have computers to work out these kind of complex calculations you needed for demography. So the only sort of group of academics and experts who had been left alone were the missile scientists, the defense, and so they had all the capital, they had all the resources, and they also had the kind of bold thinking because they hadn't been stamped on or criticized, to sort of say, well, we can do this, we can tackle this, this is how we're going to do it. The unfortunate thing was they kind of thought of it like a missile, with a certain trajectory and women's fertility that could be adjusted up and down, like flipping a switch.
Oh, that's interesting. So in a sense, their discipline, their training told them that you could tune this process as finely as you might want, and in fact, that made them a mismatch for what they were trying to do.
Well, the problem was there wasn't any input in there from economists or sociologists or Marxists who might, be able to shed some issues on how human behavior could, shape such a grand plan. I mean, it isn't rocket science to think that a nation that's so in love with sons is, when they're restricted to one child, going to have more sons, and therefore infanticide is going to come up. And at some point, maybe you're going to have more men than women. It's not rocket science.
Had other countries tried anything this radical? You call it China's most radical experiment. Had other countries tried to limit their population in ways like this? Or was
well,
this
if you look back in time in the 60s and 70s, that whole concern over overpopulation was a very major concern for many countries. It was a big idea du jour of the time. So this was the time when the zero population growth movement came in, when the Club of Rome came in. Also the UN, fund for population planning, and so on and so forth. So all these things were big concerns. I mean, MIT basically had some scenarios where basically at this time we would run out of resources. We would, doomsday scenarios. So China wasn't the only one by far, but China took the most drastic steps. India had a sterilization program. Indira Gandhi, for a time, had a forcible sterilization program. And for that, both India and China received gold medals from the UN.
So what did the rest of the world think of it when China? It sounds like, based on what you just mentioned, that the rest of the world didn't immediately recognize the negative consequences that could come about from this.
Well, I think a lot of the world still doesn't recognize the negative consequences. For a long time, first of all, there was immense support for the idea because, there was concerns that we would, overwhelm the planet and not be able to feed. So you're like, wow, China's going to take this drastic step. Good for them. That means I can, run my dryer, washer dryer, and consume more with, relative ease of mind. And also for a long time, China maintained that their population policy was being run without coercion. Now that's nonsense if anybody really thought about it for 2 seconds. How could you possibly implement something so unpopular and boast great results without some coercion being involved? But for a very long time, that was the belief for a lot of people. Either they didn't know or didn't want to know. And so you'd have, a lot of people speaking out in favor of the one-child policy. And in the course of this book, I actually talked to some, and who still to this day, environmentalists, people concerned about climate change, feminists, who still say, well, we should have something like a universal one-child policy.
Well, you write, in 1 year alone, 1983, China sterilized over 20 million people, more than the combined population of the 3 largest U.S. cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. In addition to sterilization, what else did China do in order to enforce the policy?
Well, this was such an unpopular policy for a lot of reasons. People may not necessarily have minded having only one child, but they probably did mind the intrusiveness of the state into the bedroom. So in order to make it work, basically, they needed a stick, or a variety of sticks. So forced sterilization was one. They didn't trust that people would use contraception, on their own. So they insisted, in many cases, that if after you've had your one child, you have to be sterilized. Like it or not, just do it. We don't trust that you will, handle your affairs.
This was from the beginning. This was once the policy was implemented.
Yeah, it was pretty. And then they designed these kind of IUDs that you couldn't remove yourself. You couldn't easily remove. And then there's forced abortions, of course. This was, although theoretically, I think after 6 months, forced abortions were illegal. It was in practice carried out in many cases, even as late as 2012. Where we had the issue with a woman called Feng Jianmei.
Talk about her for a second. She's a really interesting case. Who's Feng Jianmei and why did she become prominent?
Feng Jianmei was a woman who, from the countryside, and they had a daughter first, and then she was pregnant with her second child. And she had believed or hoped that the second child was permissible. They had been working in the cities, you know, and there was a certain fluidity because they were migrant workers. But in reality, her hukou, her household registration, was a rule one. And so the family planning officials came to her door and said, no, you can't have this child. If you want to have the second child, you shall have to pay a fine. And the fine was something like $6,000 at the time. It was something that they couldn't afford. They tried negotiating. There was a constant back and forth. She was trying to evade family planning officials until she carried the baby to full term because she was running the risk. They could take you for abortion. And when it came down to 7 months, they took her away with a pillowcase over her head. They took her to a hospital and forcibly injected her with something that caused her to prematurely deliver the fetus. And we would probably not have known about this, the outside world, but there was social media. This was the new thing on the landscape. And so what happened in her case was a relative had come to visit her in the hospital, and she was lying there in the bed with the fully formed fetus right next to her. And they snapped a picture and sent it on a cell phone, and this went viral in China. And this really brought forth the human face of the one-child policy.
I was living in Beijing when that happened, and I remembered it was the intersection. That case felt like the intersection between the technological change and the economic change that had been going on in China and what was a political policy that had been adopted in a very different period and was really out of step with the lives people were living. And so you had somebody who had an iPhone, was wired to the rest of the world, and yet was now found themselves captive of this policy that was, in its own way,
a relic.
A relic. So did the Feng Jianmei case actually have any impact, do you think, on policy, or do we not know?
I think it had an impact in terms of raising public awareness. For a long time before that, especially if you're a city dweller, there was a sense that the one-child policy in China was not so significant anymore, that yes, there were some issues with forced abortions and all, but these were part of a recent past. And then, you know, China was an upward swing. It was going to host the Olympics. The economy was growing so well. It just wasn't that big an issue anymore, especially since a lot of people were in private sector jobs now and could conceivably afford to pay a fine or get around it. And then migrants also were moving around in different cities, and it was much easier to avoid detection. So there was perhaps a sense that maybe it didn't matter anymore. But then the Feng Jianmei case brought forth the sense that, yes, these things are still happening.
And how many people in China are, would you say, subject to the one-child policy? I mean, there's...
Well, let's see. I mean, the one-child policy is a basket of policies, as we agreed. So say about a third of all Chinese households are restricted to that strict one-child policy. The rest have slightly more fluid restrictions, but they still do. I mean, in cases of some rural areas, you could have a second child if your first one is a girl. So that's still a restriction, right? You just can't wholeheartedly, you know, have whatever you want. Then you could maybe have a second child if you're in a dangerous profession, like if you're a coal miner or a fisherman. You could have a second child maybe if you're a part of one of China's minority tribes.
And in the fall, people may have seen there was some news in the headlines about a change in the policy. What exactly happened? What was preserved and what was discarded in that change?
So basically, China announced that it was going to move to a nationwide two-child policy. And so, but it's still a restriction. You know, you still have to get a birth permit, and so it was a looser, a bigger playpen, if you might call it that. But it's still a playpen.
So they loosen the rules, but they still intervene very directly in people's private lives and the choices they make.
Yeah, if you want to have a child, you're going to have to get a birth permit. You're going to have to show your marriage certificate. So for say, if you are a single mother, that's still, you know, practically impossible for you to get a registration for your child, first or second.
Let's switch gears for a minute. I want to talk about you and how you got interested in this subject. If you can, you write in the book, I am the youngest of 5 daughters, all conceived in hopes of a son that never was. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Malaysia. I'm what they call Huaqiao, you know, overseas Chinese. So my grandparents were from Guangdong, and they migrated to Malaysia. But, you know, they say that Huaqiao are actually the most traditional. We cling to the old ways. We didn't have anything like the Cultural Revolution to shake our thinking up. So we kept to a lot of the old ways. And in my family's case, one of the old ways was a big reverence for sons. My father was himself the 16th son, 1/6, out of 18. Yeah, and that's just counting the boys, by the way. You know,
this is one mother?
No, there were several. My grandfather was a rich man. He had 3 wives. And so, and they counted the sons. So he was the 16th son from the 3rd wife.
In China, or was that in Malaysia already?
In Malaysia, yeah. But
and so when you were growing up, did you have a sense of China? Did it loom in the family story, or was this really a distant place for you?
It wasn't. It was always there. China was always there in the background in terms of our cultural traditions. I mean, when I was a child growing up, if I transgressed, if I did something wrong, I would be, made to kneel in front of my ancestral tablets, holding my ears like that, very traditional punishment. And also, I mean, because we were 5 daughters, every time we showed up at a clan gathering, all the aunts and would just cluck, disapprovingly, and they say, oh, you should be glad you weren't in China. You'd never be born, or you'd be put out in the village well and given away. You wouldn't exist.
You write, my accountant father never ceased regretting his lack of a son, nor reminding his daughters that they were liabilities, not assets. And does he mean that in financial terms, that you were liabilities? Or?
Oh yeah, he did count that way. He was an auditor. He made, and so when we were growing up, for example, we were very aware of the fact that he wasn't going to spend a lot of money to send us to college or educate us beyond a certain level because we were girls. It would be very different if we were boys.
Did he do that? In fact, did he pay for your college education, or was that?
No, actually, I went to college my own, and I paid for it with scholarships and things.
And by that point, did you already know you wanted to be a writer?
I sort of did, and this harkens back a little bit. When I was 16 years old, and in Kuala Lumpur, I won a minor competition, essay
a writing
competition. Yeah, it was a Commonwealth essay, and it was British colonies, all British colonies submitted their little essays, and I wrote something incredibly ponderous and boring that I can't even remember. But the offshoot of that was I was invited to meet the Queen of England. And she had just happened to be in Malaysia for some sort of meeting. And this was probably the most exciting thing that ever happened to me before. I was just this, teenager in Malaysia. And not only that, I was invited to meet the Queen. My parents were invited to meet the Queen, and they were very excited. And, for my father, it was just the first time he looked at me and thought, well, okay, she's not a liability. Maybe she's an asset.
So then you decided to become a journalist at some point, and you'd already at that point paid for your own college education, and so later on you decided, I want to go to China. And had you already been working as a journalist, and then you said, now I want to figure out a way to get assigned to China, or what was the path that led you there?
Well, I started off as a journalist in Singapore. I had a scholarship from a local paper company there, so my first job was working at a tabloid as a crime reporter, and they would send us young girl reporters out to interview bereaved relatives in funeral homes. That was the start of it all. And I sort of felt at that point that there was more to journalism than this, the same questions, very generic kind of stories spun out. But I wasn't sure. I didn't think that path was going to be in China. I speak Bahasa Indonesia much more fluently than I speak in Mandarin, and I thought maybe I would be an Indonesian correspondent. But, China seemed to be too close to the bone. It was too full of graspy relatives that were, would be me in another setting if I weren't lucky enough to be born somewhere else because my grandparents had migrated. It was full of stories. I had relatives who go, oh, don't go to China. They have no doors in their toilets. It was too close to the bone. It wasn't glamorous or sexy enough. But somehow my path led me there. The Journal posted me to Hong Kong, and the Wall Street Journal posted me to Hong Kong in 2003, right in the midst of the SARS. And that was how it started.
And then you were posted to mainland China when? When did you come to Beijing?
In 2006. But even before then, I was doing a lot of reporting on southern China about manufacturing. I was the factory girl, basically.
And you and your husband, Andrew Lee, who's also an author, I should say, scholar at American University, you lived in Beijing for how many years?
We lived in Beijing for about 4 years, close enough.
And during that period, I imagine, based on what you've described, that you were already getting interested in the subject of the one-child policy. We'll talk in a moment about the moment that really galvanized that. But did you begin to see it around you? Were you seeing the effects of the policy already at that point?
I was already seeing effects of the policy in Hong Kong back in 2003. I was going down to all these factories in China. China was basically the factory of the world. And all around Dongguan, there were all these factories that made everything from jeans and brassieres and toenail clippers. And it was fascinating. But around about 2003, I started to hear from factory owners who said, we can't get workers. We can't get enough workers. We're experiencing difficulty. And I said, how can you possibly be having difficulty? China is the most populous nation. And so, I talked to a lot of economists about what kind of theories they had. And even at the time, there was a sense, okay, maybe it's a one-child policy, but then there was a sense that it was too soon, that that this was a short-term economic issue. But really, that was the beginning of when it was going to happen.
So then something happened in 2008 that made you focus in a new way on the one-child policy. What was it that happened?
Yes. In 2000, I'd been moved up to Beijing to write about the Olympics. And it wasn't because I knew anything about sports. I don't. But the Olympics was basically a wonderful prism to view China in a lot of ways as a rising nation, as a the kind of big money that was going into the Olympics, the sponsorships, the marketing, the face issues, the change in sociology and infrastructure. It was wonderful. But something happened in early May that sort of derailed that whole story, and that was a earthquake in Sichuan that had So at that time when the earthquake happened, I was actually in a border of Myanmar, trying to sneak in.
And for people who don't remember, the earthquake in Sichuan killed tens of thousands of people. It really was the largest quake that China had had in a long time, right? And you said that at the time you happened to be covering Myanmar. You were down
Well,
south.
I was trying to cover another natural disaster. I was trying to sneak into Myanmar to look at what was happening after Cyclone Nargis happened. At that time Myanmar was very restrictive. They didn't let in any journalists. And then so I was frustrated. I couldn't get in. So then I stomped on a plane and flew back to Beijing, unaware that China was having its own natural disaster under me, which was in Sichuan. So when I landed in Beijing and I, turned on my BlackBerry and I was like, what happened? And then, I was like, oh no. And all my colleagues, everybody, all the reporters were all made a beeline for Chengdu. And I felt like I had missed the story. I'd flown back too early. I was like, I should have stayed down there. I could have driven there. Then I started to think, well, how can I do the story? There must be many ways to skin a cat, right? So I thought, Sichuan is a place that supplies the most of guest workers to China. It's like China's Appalachia. It's very poor. It's very populous. A lot of the people go to other parts of China in search of work. So I thought, well, there must be a lot of people, Sichuanese people in Beijing, and some of them must be trying to get back home. So what if I follow a group of them? And so I followed a group of construction workers back home. It took us about 3 days. We rode trains and bikes and boats. And it was a very sad journey because at the end of it all, most of them discovered that their family had been killed, their children had been killed.
For people who may not know, of course, at the time, the Sichuan earthquake was a very difficult place to do reporting. The government had taken steps to try to make it, they were trying to manage the story, in effect, to try to control the narrative that was going to get out to the rest of the world. And so when you got there, one of the things that you discovered was that there were a lot of families that had lost their one child. Is that right?
Yeah, the thing I didn't realize until later on was that Shifang, the area where they had, which was near the epicenter, was actually a area where they had a test pilot of the one-child policy before they took it nationwide in 1980, in the late 1970s. So they were very coercive there. They really brought down the results. And that had actually given the China's planners the kind of heart and inspiration to take it nationwide. They said, with this, we can do this in Sichuan, we can do this for the rest of China. Of course, consequently, 30-something years later, the end result was very tragic for these families. They lost their only child in many cases. So one of the first and earliest stories I did after that was about all these families who, in a matter of weeks, were rushing off to do reverse vasectomies to reverse the sterilization process they had been forced to undergo.
There's a term which is, if there's ever been a distinctly Chinese term, it's probably this one, which is shidu. Can you talk to us about what that means?
Shidu is a term that means the parents who have lost their only child. Death, and du for lone, only. And it's a new phenomena. Basically, it started from the Sichuan earthquake. Nobody knew to call it that then. But there are about about 1 million of Shidu parents now, by some estimates, and about 76,000 of them joining them yearly. And what makes them different is they have consistently tried to lobby Beijing for more benefits, more help, because their argument is, look, to lose an only child in a Chinese context is, in many cases, to lose economic security. China still hasn't developed a social safety net to compensate. Family was still very important. So when you lose your only child, very frequently you lose, all your retirement plan. And that's just a pure economic sense. But then, of course, there are emotional issues, and there are also even issues as far as trying to get into a nursing home. There are cases in nursing homes that won't let Shuru parents, they don't want to admit Shuru parents because they say, since you have no progeny to authorize treatments or authorize payments, we prefer not to admit you. We want people with kids to log in.
So did people, I mean, generally speaking, and I know it can be hard to generalize, but did people in China rally around the Shuru parents, the people who had lost their only child? Did that become a point of sympathy, or did people say something else?
Well, it is, people are sympathetic, but at the same time, there's also a sense of maybe almost stigma in some cases because, you know, when you lose your only child, especially in a rural context, you actually fall down the societal totem pole. China, despite the fact that they're down to a one-child family situation, still values the family. You're not fully considered an adult until you're married. You don't really have a status unless you're a parent. When you lose that parenthood status, you lose many things along the way.
One of the things that's always been interesting to me is that when you talk to people in China, young people, about the one-child policy, sometimes you find that they say, even though we know about these cases of coercion and everything else, that sometimes they'll say, well, look, if it hadn't been for this one-child policy, I never would have gotten into college. It's already so competitive. What do you make of that view? And also, I should say, you know, it's always perilous to try to describe Chinese attitudes too broadly. You know, how do the Chinese people feel about things? But how do they regard the one-child policy?
I think many of them do support. There's an oft-cited study by the Pew Center that was done in 2008 that said that 2/3 of Chinese people support the one-child policy. Now, I looked into that questionnaire. It was down to one question that people asked, and it was like, do you support the one-child policy? And then it was a yes or no kind of a thing. So I think it wasn't very nuanced, and there's certainly more room for a more, for example, if you ask people what they thought of the kind of fees that you had to pay if you break one, I mean, that's a much more varied response there. But that's it. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people did support the idea of reducing population. Because, you know, if you ever lived in China and had to get in a subway at rush hour or get into a right school, you really do understand that whole concept of 人太多, too many people, and you do support it. So I think, as a matter of fact, it's kind of sad that the Communist Party squandered this kind of goodwill that people had by channeling into such a painful course, because there wasn't a lot of support for people to reduce the population. There was, but I don't think they necessarily wanted to support things like forced abortions and sterilizations, of course.
When you were writing about this, those of us who are hold foreign passports but write about China and do for a long time face the question of, well, what is our place as a foreign writer? Do we have the right, the responsibility to criticize policies in China? There is a view that, well, look, China is its own place. They should govern themselves by their own rules. What do you make of that idea?
I think we want to take a measured view, yes, and certainly as ethnic Chinese and people, and someone with Chinese family in China, I have enormous sympathy for the idea of, well, yes, we should, China should grow economically, and of course it's a wonderful idea that, in 1 or 2 generations we've seen everybody go from a bicycle, aspiration for a bicycle, to, BMW. Yes, good for them, yeah. So if the one-child policy had helped people get to that stage, I would be all for it, But then the problem was it didn't. It really didn't have that much to do with this economic growth that China had for the last 30 years.
And that's one of the crucial insights from this book. A question about the book. Will it be published in mainland China?
Oh, that's a story there. 3 years ago when I signed a book contract, I did receive an offer for the Chinese rights from a state-owned Chinese publication company. They wanted to buy the rights, they wanted to publish the book, but they wanted to reserve the right to alter anything that was sensitive. And I was like, I hadn't written a book yet. I don't know what you consider sensitive. Let's table the offer until I finish the book. Now, I finished the book, but in the 3 years in the intervening point, censorship has tightened to the point where that offer is off the table. So I don't know. I would like to see a Chinese version of the book out there somewhere.
Perhaps in Hong Kong or in Taiwan is also an option. When did the government begin to realize that it needed to change the one-child policy?
Around about 10, 15 years ago, a group of sociologists and demographers, many of them U.S. trained but Chinese, had started rallying together to collate scientific evidence that showed that this one-child policy was really leading China on a path to demographic disaster. They found all these numbers that showed that the birth rates had plunged far faster than people thought. They found all these issues of gender imbalance, and so they presented this evidence to the Chinese Communist Party, and they said, when the one-child policy was conceived, it was never meant to last forever. I think they originally had a timeline of about 30 years, and they said, we'll keep it for 30 years, and then might change it to something else. And at that point, so they were lobbying to say, let's do this and let's end this faster because you've achieved whatever results you have, and there are all these issues looming ahead. We should encourage people to have more children now, not less. But the Communist Party dragged its heels. It didn't say yes, and so 35, 36 years down the line is when it's made this change. And now people say maybe it's too little, too late.
Well, when they started to say that, was that view greeted warmly by the government, or did they say, well, look, that's not consistent with the kinds of political language we're using, so let's put this data aside? How did they respond? I
think there was a sense that, okay, baby, we might change this. I mean, it wasn't met with a huge amount of resistance. I think it was more an issue of structural problems that they would need to do, because the one-child policy had created this, in order to enforce it, they had created this huge system, right? They had a ministry that basically administered state family planning and the State Family Planning Commission, and this trickled all the way down to the small provinces. And, for something so complex as, people's sex lives, you had to have, really intimate workings. And so this is huge machinery that came up around it, and it had, thrived on a collection of fines that they collected from people. So to dismantle this huge structure, to take away that massive source of revenue to all these states was clearly something that was going to be painful. So I don't think there was much of an argument about the demographic problems that were being caused. It was more an issue of, well, how do we take it down?
Interest groups politics, like so many things. So you write in the book that China is now confronting a population that is too old, too male, and too few. Which of these is the most serious problem, do you think?
I think too old, because that's definitely happening. China has, now I think by 2050, China will, 1 in every 4 Chinese will be a retiree. And so if China were to form, senior China were to form its own country, it would be the world's 3rd largest country. There would be China, India, and senior China as the 3 largest, most populous countries. So. And that really hasn't anything to do with the one-child policy. It basically has to do with this big population growth of a cohort that were born before the one-child policy that are basically just living longer. So that's not. But the problem the one-child policy has is it reduced the working population that you need to support this aging army. That's the big issue. And unless there's a short of famine or war or something, these people are definitely going to grow older. It's definitely happening. So some of the other problems engendered, like the gender imbalance and what this could result in, for example, whether this results in a more warlike China, some of this speculation, right, we don't know for sure. But we definitely know that, this big group of elderly people are going to age, and with that, that's going to raise a whole lot of issues for China.
So today, of course, we're seeing China's economy beginning to slow after 3 decades of rapid growth. Is any of that slowing related to the one-child policy?
Well, it is because, one of the big problems is China, originally started off as an export-led economy, manufacturing, basically. And that manufacturing was powered by cheap labor, which, is a question of abundance, right? And now, of course, that abundance has gone down. There's just fewer workers, and they want to get paid more. And so China's trying to transition out of that into a more, consumer-based economy. But then you have a problem there, too, because now you have a huge aging population. Now, aging consumers don't spend that much, across economies. We don't see, they don't buy the latest cell phones or the latest cars. And in China's particular case, we look at their seniors now, they save a huge amount. So, one of the things I write in the book is, China's attempts to sort of transition to this and to have a huge nation of retirees, it's going to be as helpful as the Great Wall was as helpful in repelling, northern invaders. It's not going to be that easy.
Yeah, I've been to places in Beijing over the years. For instance, I went to a school that used to be a kindergarten and is now a retirement home because there has been this total inversion in the way that the population is organized. There's just now many retirees and not enough small kids. Do you get the sense that, is there a way to predict what the economic effects will be down the line of that kind of absence of the working
Well, if we
working
look
class?
at other countries that have, massive aging population, senior population, Japan is one example, and certainly Japan's economy has stalled. I mean, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the age demographic. So that's definitely a demographic headwind. Now, in China's case, it's hard to say definitively, but one, their population, aging senior population, is going to be by far much larger than Japan's down the line. And secondly, they're much less richer than Japan is when Japan arrived at this juncture. So that's going to be much, much harder too. And so many other attendant things like hospices, everything else is far less developed. Basically, the rest of the world had about 50 years to transition to an aging economy. China's done it in 25, half the amount of time, so much less preparation.
Yeah, people often say that China got old before it got rich.
Yep.
Another problem that you identify, and a very interesting one, is the gender imbalance. And you write, quote, "The world has never seen such a huge national collection of bachelors, men who will not be able to find mates unless China opens its doors to massive immigration, a highly unlikely scenario," unquote. How much of a gender imbalance is there today, and why should we care about that?
Well, there are about 30 million more men than women in China, men of marriageable age. That's about the size of Canada. So that's pretty significant, right? And this are men typically within the lowest social economic stratus, poor countryside people typically. So there's been a lot of concerns. Every society that's had a big gender imbalance has not been a happy society. In the case of the Middle East, for example, we've seen enormous social unrest. The Arab Spring, for example. I mean, in that case, I remember demographers identified the group of, an unusually large group of men of a certain age. They called it the male youth bulge.
The male youth bulge.
Tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, they did say that. So, so in China's case, we don't know for sure. There have been a lot of theories of whether this means that China will be more aggressive militarily, and that could be a problem. Although I think there are many reasons why China could be more aggressive and muscular, and not necessarily because they have a gender imbalance. But I think a more significant one that you can tie your head to is you can see in China, in areas where they have a much bigger gender imbalance, more males than females, there's definitely a corresponding uptick in the crime rates. And economists have actually been able to work it out to something like a rise in 6 points for every, for gender imbalance.
A rise in the crime rate.
Yes.
So what is China trying to do about it? The fact that they have this gender imbalance. Is there anything they can do at this point, or is it is the ball already?
Well, I think
that
the move to the two-child policy is sort of a sop towards that. They want to encourage people to have more children, and hopefully down the line this will reduce things. But of course, babies take time to grow and become brides. That is assuming they come about at all. So we're not going to be able to see any kind of alleviation of that for the next 20, 25 years. Now, I just read recently that China was trying to incorporate some sort of encourage overseas Chinese to come back. I think they're trying to do what like India is doing with the overseas Indian card. They're encouraging overseas Chinese to migrate back. Now, I don't know that there's going to be any big success or take-up for that, and certainly I doubt if there'll be anything, close to those kind of numbers. And overseas Chinese who migrate back are not going to be the kind of women who are going to want to marry peasant farmers anyway. So
there's this mismatch in effect, because
Yes.
you've got women in the city who are now gaining more education, but then there are these men out in the countryside known as bare branches, right? Bare branches of the family
bare
tree.
branches of the family, guanggong. But the women themselves are not necessarily in a better off position, I argue. Now, the one-child policy was, in many ways, very beneficial for urban women born after 1980. If you were born in a city, you didn't have any siblings to compete with, your chances of getting better fed, better educated, the best time compared to any other previous time in Chinese history. So that was good for a while, but then the problem, as I argue now, is that you're living in a society where there are much fewer women than men. Now, if you think in traditional economic terms, that should mean that should suggest that you have the upper hand, you have the power. But China is still a very paternalistic society, so it suggests, I think, that there will be more pressure on women to get married, and women may also be seen more as a sort of a scarce commodity. We don't see women getting more valued in a traditional sense. We see a rising mistress culture, concubines. You see hardly any women at the top levels of Chinese bureaucracy. So I don't see that happening.
And why do you think it's not happening? Because you're right, the rules of supply and demand would suggest that the value of women in Chinese society should be going up. What do you think's at work there?
Well, it's hard to uproot an age-old centuries culture. So on a personal level, I mean, of course, we can all name lots of high achieving Chinese women, but the structure itself is still very, very male centric. For example, China has only just recently passed their first domestic violence law, now. And then there's still a lot of issues that favor inheritance for male lines, that favor the registration of property for men over women. So, all these things are inherently built in. So until and when they change, women still come against the glass ceiling or bamboo ceiling or whatever you call it.
Do you think, to what degree can the Chinese government at this point try to undo some of the economic, political, and demographic effects of the one-child policy?
I think one of the first things they're going to do is probably raise the retirement age. They need to. They've got such a huge aging population, and China has one of the earliest retirement age. You can retire as early as 50 years old. I mean, that's like unheard of in many parts of the world. So they're going to do that, but of course that's very unpopular on a personal level too. A lot of people want to retire. They don't want to be told that they have to delay it. So that's going to happen. They're definitely trying to build up their social service safety nets as fast as they can, and they've made great inroads, but it's still not enough, not by far.
When you look at the legacy of the one-child policy, is there anything in there that makes you say, well, this was a good thing, this part of it was a good thing?
I think what was a good thing was what came before that. I mean, China started off on the path that a lot of other people did. I mean, the problem is we tend to confuse the one-child policy as a be-all, end-all, that it needed to be done, that there was no other alternative. And really it was more of a graduated process. China started off doing the things that other countries did to try and lower the population growth by, making more contraceptives available, teaching sex education in schools, and also encouraging more equality for the sexes. So these were all good things along the way. But somewhere on the path, it decided that it really needed to juice it up economically and take this very extreme sort of a approach. And that's when it all went apart.
And this has sort of been a hallmark of the governance of the last 60 years or so, is the idea that you take something that could on its face be valuable, but then if you turn it into a great leap policy.
Yeah, it's the leapism kind of a thinking. Let's do this great, radical thing, and we can leapfrog, and we'll get in front of everyone else, and we'll be top.
One of the things that's really interesting that you did in this book is that you looked at the fact that, after all, now they've begun to change the policy into what's known as a two-child policy, and yet people aren't rushing out the next day and having that second child. What's going on? How many people are, in fact, taking advantage of the policy, do you think?
Well, the thing is, China's been kind of easing, this policy for a while now. So about 2 years ago, before they announced this two-child policy, they announced a variation of it, loosening, what they call the dandu exception, that if one of the couple was a single child, then they would be able to have a second child. And from that, the take-up was very low. I think less than 15% of all eligible couples, took it up. So, I think so people extrapolate from that and say the two-child policy is probably going to be very similar. And then so when they look back at all the reasons they went back, there was a lot of public opinion that basically we can't support a second child. The costs are too expensive. But also inherently, the one-child policy has become, successful in that sense. It's changed the mindset of the Chinese family, of what is considered the best kind of Chinese family. And now, for many people, the concept is one child, because we are going to give everything that is best to that one child.
Invest in that one kid.
That this is that economic advantages lie with having one child.
One of the things you looked at in here, which is fascinating, is that 10 or 15 years ago, people talked about the rise of the little emperors, the Xiao Huangdi. These were the one child who had been the object of all the attention from 2 parents and 4 grandparents, and everybody worried, oh my God, are we going to get a generation of spoiled kids? What happened to the little emperors?
Well, he grew up. He or she, they all grew up, and then the earliest of them all in their 30s. So they're 35, and so their parents are in their 50s and 60s, their grandparents in their 80s and 90s. And that little pampered child, who is the object or receptacle of all this wonderful expectation and love, is going to have to give back in full, in sixfold, to all this here. They call it the 4-2-1 structure. So that sense of the little emperor becoming a little slave, I think, is happening more because, China already has something like 25% of the world's Parkinson's sufferers. In a matter of 20 years, that's going to jump to 60%. And it's similar metrics across the board for dementia and everything else that afflicts old age.
Yeah.
So can you imagine that little one emperor, that one child having to deal with it? It's not even a financial issue in some cases. We all in the Western world know how difficult it is to care for aging parents and emotional sense, the demands you have, and imagine having to shuttle that all between 2, 3, 4 adults.
Yeah, well, it's probably the same for you, but I have a lot of Chinese friends who talk about this above all. The burden of trying to support their parents as a couple is really extraordinary and unique because no other country's been down this road.
It also has a bearing on the decision to have more children. In many cases, as some of my friends say, well, I don't want to have a second child because I don't know that I can take care of my parents and my grandparents. They're going to have all these demands of my time, so I cannot, in all good conscience, have a larger family of children.
But historically, of course, Chinese families were large. As you said, I think it was your grandfather who was one of 16 kids. Do you think that China's going to go back in the direction of large families, or do you think there will be a sort of cultural overhang that will go on for a long time with these small families?
I don't see how they can. I mean, urbanization has come down to force. So, so many people have moved to the cities now for the first time in history. The balance is more in favor of, urban versus rural. So, where are all these large families going to live together? It was much different when you're on the farm. You just open up another room or dig another hole, or bingo. That takes care of your extra children. Where are you going to do this, especially with soaring housing prices in large cities?
Have other countries tried to copy what China did when it comes to the population management policy, the one-child policy, or something like it?
Certainly in the 70s, there was a large amount of propaganda. None of them went to the extreme of the one-child policy, but there was enormous amount of propaganda going into the fact that you should be selfish or crazy to have more. I mean, I was in Malaysia and next door Singapore. I mean, Singapore's tiny, smaller than New York City, but they also had propaganda campaigns. And I remember seeing pictures where you would have a loaf of bread and many hands reaching for it. So, have two, stop at two. That was their campaign, So many countries did do it, but none of them went that extreme route, and most of them now are in also issue with declining population. They're faced with a declining population. They've all, to various degrees, tried to turn on the baby tap with no success.
One of the really interesting elements of One Child, of your book, is that you got pregnant in the course of working as a journalist in China. Talk to me about that experience. How did that shape your sense of this issue, and what was your experience?
So, I have polycystic ovarian syndrome. I know it sounds so clinical, but basically it's a leading cause of infertility. So for a long time, I wasn't sure if I was going to have children, if I wanted children, if I could have them. So when the earthquake happened, I was 36. I wasn't sure. I was still on the fence, but I was also aware that time was running out. I wouldn't have the luxury of choice very soon. Now, when the earthquake happened and I was busy accompanying these parents and following them to the end of their journey and the horrors there, I did not realize it at the time, but I was myself pregnant, and I didn't know it. So when I went back to Beijing and I was feeling really tired and depressed, I thought, it's because of the stories. But then I tested and went for the scan, and then suddenly I could see. And I tried to be very restrained about it, but it's very hard when you see a scan and you see the heart beating. It's very hard not to get attached. And you really, at that point, you're like, I'm writing about people who've lost their children. I'm pregnant. This is a very strange. You understand some of the pull and the ties and the reasons why people want children. And then I had a miscarriage, and this all happened before the Olympics, on the eve of the Olympics. And again, so I was, very devastated by that. I tried to work my way through it. And then later on, I had IVF in Beijing. and it's a really very strange process, and I was having it. And at the same time, then I discovered there were a whole class of people that were using, IVF and all these other technologies to try and get around the one-child policy. Many of them were trying to get multiples so that they wouldn't, say, lose their job if they were a government official.
They were trying to get multiples in because they were only going to get essentially one shot at it.
That's one shot. So if you get twins, it's counted as a single birth. Then, I met a woman who was a teacher, for example, and she said that if she had 2 children, she would lose her job. So she was deliberately going for IVF and all. And then sales, and it's not even IVF, people would take clomiphene and all sorts of fertility drugs for the same thing. So. And there were some places where they had fake twins. People would register their second child as a twin, if they're born very close together. And then there were some villages in Yunnan where they had like a huge percentage of fake twins. I mean, people in China will try to get around the policy. You can't blame them. So there were all these ingenious ways to think. And so, the interesting part in this was basically when technology allows you something that policy does not, then you see all sorts of strange variants coming in.
People begin to improvise. So having the IVF in Beijing really gave you access to a world that most people would never see. As a writer, that was enormously important, it sounds like.
Yeah, and at the same time, I kind of felt a little hesitant about writing all this out because, here's the thing, right? We write in a world of policy and economics. The idea of miscarriages and babies, and it's also so messy, so female. And I had editors who basically said, I'm not sure we want to hear this, what is all this stuff? It's too Oprah, we're talking about policy, important things, China's the second most largest. But at the same time, I thought you can't possibly be writing about something that's as intimate as this without weaving in some of this, because this is, at the heart of it, a story about families.
Well, and you have twins now yourself, and I imagine the experience of being a parent has probably also shaped the way that you look at this subject.
Yes, I do. I mean, now when we hear all these stories about Chinese people not wanting to have the second child or weighing all the cost and differences that go into it, I certainly understand it. Having children does curtail your freedom somewhat. And I'm not a roving foreign correspondent anymore, and that's one reason why. So on a personal level, many families in China are making these decisions.
I can't let you go today without talking a little bit about what's on a lot of people's minds, and that's the Chinese economy right now. You, of course, are a Wall Street Journal reporter for a long time. You won a Pulitzer Prize for your coverage. When you look at what's happening in China, do you see a country that is on the precipice of an economic transformation, a hard landing, as they say, or do you see a place that is doing something else?
I definitely see China as in a much more challenging place economically. That's no great stretch. In the past, there was all low-hanging fruit, right? They just come out of the Cultural Revolution. They were very poor. So all the things they did, moving people from the countryside to the cities, taking advantage of this cheap labor, that was all, easy to do. And so the gains were very, very, very quick and rapid. And now this is the hard part, the things they have to do to keep growth on it. They're going to have to do a lot more with a lot less people. If you have fewer mouths, then you're going to have to increase productivity. But are they spending in the right way on education and all those things? I mean, Chinese universities are pretty bad. That's why we see such a huge flood of graduate students, say, to American institutions. The reason why we have smart graduates from China is not because of the universities. It's because of the huge population. It's because of natural talent. Mm-hmm. So I don't see a very hopeful picture going ahead. I don't know that graying societies make for vibrant societies economically, and that's certainly the issue that China's going to have to face coming up ahead.
One of the other things that China is going to face and the rest of the world will face is what does it mean to have a more powerful China in Asia? And what does it mean for the United States and, of course, also for Southeast Asia? You have family in Malaysia. Mm-hmm. How do other people in Southeast Asia, on the perimeter of China's world, how do they regard China's rise? Do they embrace it? Do they find it somehow threatening? What's your sense of that?
I think they embraced it initially because it was good. Rising tide lifts all boats. But now they're looking at it with great nervousness. Because of China's moves, it's much more aggressive in the East Asians and the Southeast Asian seas, and so you can't help but get wonder what's going to happen down the horizon. And also Chinese policies are dictating now a lot more of what all these regions have to do and say. So it's a lot of tiptoeing around.
Do you get the sense that this is about your experience as a writer in China? There is a lot of pressure on writers. Did you encounter any obstacles in the course of doing the reporting for this book?
Initially, when I was in Sichuan and places like that, I had been on one occasion at least detained for a while. There was another occasion where the public security chased my car. But, I'm fortunate because I have a foreign passport, even I have a Chinese face. So that protected me. And I wish I could say the same for some of the other activists and writers that have tried to explore these issues and are now behind bars.
Well, you have spent a lot of time in the United States and, of course, a lot of time also in Asia. One of the interesting puzzles that we all face is what's going to happen in this relationship between the United States and China. For a long time, I think a lot of us presumed that we would, because of technology and the march of time, become more like each other. Do you think that's true? And if it's not true, what is happening, do you think, today?
Well, I think basically because China's rising, then almost by natural course, this. I think basically because China's rising, then almost by natural course, this relationship's going to get more fractures. The U.S. is used to being the supreme power for a long time, and it's going to have to make room for the second one. If you want to use the one-child analogy, it's sort of like, the child that's used to being the only child is going to have to deal with a sibling and all the issues that come with it. But that's it. And if we talk about, they say something like one-child policy, we're used to thinking of it as a purely Chinese and a the issue. But the fact of the matter is, it's also affected Americans. There have been over 120,000 children that were adopted from China, and out of that, about 70% of these are in American households. We have, for example, given limited asylum to seekers of the one-child policy. We have children as beneficiaries of the one-child policy that are all swelling our universities and colleges and paying full free. So it's a relationship that's both mutual coexistent, but also, like siblings, quarreling. And I think there will be more quarreling coming up ahead.
Do you think you'll go back to China to do more writing?
I don't know if China's going to let me in. I would like to.
And at this point, you don't have plans to publish it on the mainland. Do you plan to publish it in Chinese in Hong Kong or Taiwan elsewhere?
I would like to, so I'm looking into that. Yeah.
Well, Mei Fong, thank you so much for talking with us about One Child, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Evan.
That was Afterwards, Book TV's signature program in which authors of the latest nonfiction books are interviewed.